What's going on, everybody? Todd Shellnut here. I'm going to talk to you today about the fundamentals of instruction. We've already had a little brief introduction, but this information, when you go to teach it, is usually like the biggest Achilles heel of normally everyone that tries to teach this information, because a lot of you out there are really good at memorizing information. So if I ask you to memorize something or to give me back an acronym, it's great. You can do that. It's no problem whatsoever. But it's getting to that standing up in front of people, the conversation, having a conversation about this knowledge, and to teach someone about it. I call it conversational talking, because if you just can't talk about it, you definitely can't teach it. So when we're looking at how to prepare ourselves, of course, we know that we have to go to the flight instructor practical test standards. And if we look here where it says definitions of human behavior, so I know that the very first thing, if I want to talk about human behavior and effective communication, that the very first thing I want to talk about is the definition of human behavior. So how do I prepare myself? How do I work this into a presentation? Well, I want to go over to my book, which is your Aviation Instructor's Handbook and Start on Human Behavior. And then I just want to read down through here, so we'll kind of stop on this page. You can actually see here's definitions of human behavior. But what I've also done is I've put together a PowerPoint presentation. And not necessarily for my clients, but as well as myself. Because when I went through and tried to learn how am I going to present this information to a student, well, I didn't have any information as well. I didn't copy anybody's information. I had to design my own course. So this is the very first page here, what you see of my PowerPoint presentation. And of course, if I go to the next slide, it just says this is for task A. But if I go to the next slide, you can see that I mimic all three of these things are going to mimic. So the Flight Instructor Practical Test Standard says I've got to talk about the definitions of human behavior. Of course, in the FAA Instructor's Handbook, the very first thing we see is definitions of human behavior. And in my PowerPoint, I have listed the 3 definitions of human behavior that are listed within this paragraph line here. And then I've also put some other items in here, which I thought after reading the text, I was like, wow, that's a pretty powerful thing. And I thought it would be good to have that in the lesson as well. So I kept that in there. So if I go back to the Flight Instructor Practical Test Standards, and I'm starting to prepare myself. I've got a little bit of knowledge here. I know what the definitions of human behavior is. But how do I start it? Well, if we look here in the objective for Task A, it says to determine that the applicant exhibits instructional knowledge of human behavior and effective communication, and how these impact effective learning. So you want to center around your opening with this examiner about how these items impact effective learning. Matter of fact, you should probably include that in your opening statement. Like, all right, today, sir, we're going to be talking about human behavior and effective communication, and it's very important for me as an instructor to understand the human behavior of a person so I can understand what goes into motivating them, as well as it's very important for me to be able to effectively communicate with my client, because if I can't communicate with them correctly, they're probably not going to learn effectively. And these things directly impact effective learning. So that would be an example of an opening statement. By all means, please steal my opening statement. If you like it, you can use it. If you don't, come up with something else. That's the good thing about this stuff. It needs to be very original. Back in the day when I went through this, it was all very original. Nobody had any of this other name-branded crap. God, I call it that because I'm telling you, I've seen everything marketable on the industry in regards to the CFI initial training, and everything out there is just completely horrible. It's deplorable. It's boring. You know, they talk in this book about how the average age of a student pilot is. Let's actually look here. You can look at the data right here that it says in here. The average age of a student pilot is 34, while the average age of a maintenance student is 25. Well, maybe they should ask them what the average age of a student is who wants to be a CFI in the United States because they're trying to become something else. It's not 34 years old, FAA. It's like between 18 and 23. And they write this crappy information they got out there on the market. They write it all for like some 30 to 40, 50-year-old person. And I'm like, dude, get with it. You gotta be a hipster. You gotta be hip like me, you know? Get in with the crowd, you know what I'm saying? Yeah. But anyway, I digress. Or however you say that word. I'm gonna do that. I'm going to back off that right there. Let's get back to this thing. Because now that you can actually see that it actually has a point. My point is that you've got to design it for the people who are going to be listening to it. So hopefully my soothing yet very energetic voice will be able to not only put you to sleep, but it should be able to make you retain the information if you listen to it long enough while you're sleeping. Anyway, so the very first thing I would go over, of course, would be over here on my PTS, my opener. And I want to explain to the examiner what I'm trying to do. And then I would go right into the definitions of human behavior. So you've heard my opener. Now let's hear me talk as a student, and let's go into the next one. So I'd go, okay, so let's, being that we know why we need to know this information, let's talk a little bit about it. So the first thing I want to talk about is the definitions of human behavior. And of course, we have 3 different definitions. You can choose any one you like. But it's an attempt to explain how and why humans function the way they do. It can also be the product of factors that cause people to act in very predictable ways, or the result of attempts to satisfy certain needs. Now, I did have these other 2 on here, so after I give the definition, I'd like to be able to explain a little bit about why fear will usually cause a fight or flight, and that I want to also explain that it deals with a human's needs, and what seems to motivate them. So, after I give them the definition, I would say that no matter what someone wants to do, which is all these things here, it's basically like you're wanting to do something. People who are in this class, what do you want to do? Yeah, you want to be a CFI. Why? Yeah, so you can get the flight time. Why? Yeah, exactly right. So you can go fly for the airlines. Very good. 100,000 bonus points to everybody today in the class for that, because that's very good. You can actually see how this is going already and how this information is very fruitful to help you do that. But there could be an amount of fear. Like what? What's the fear involved with it? Well, we could have just a genuine fear of somebody sitting in the right seat and a person not knowing anything sitting in the left-hand seat. That's a pretty big amount of fear right there, right? With this class, sure. Maybe your fear is spin training. Maybe your fear is just getting through the course. Maybe your fear is the check ride. Everybody talks about how this check ride is the most failed check ride that you can ever take. It's a big, huge failure rate. And there is, but not if you listen to what I'm telling you. I can help you through the ground portion because I think I know what I'm talking about. I think I'm pretty good at this. So you listen to this and I can show you how to talk about this stuff. I can't beat the information into your head. That costs extra. Anyway, so it deals with the human's needs and what seems to motivate them. So I've got this out of the way, but I want to be able to transition myself from number 1 to number 2. So I've talked about the definitions of human behavior. My next thing is human needs and motivation, which is human needs, that Maslow's hierarchy crap. And then you have your motivation stuff that you have to talk about. So I've got to be able to make that transition. How am I going to go transition in my conversation from number 1 to number 2? So we say, like for instance, I create these little things called tie-ins. And what I do is I figure up some type of little conversation thing to go from 1 to 2. So I've talked about definitions of human behavior, and then I say, now that we've understand what human behavior is, let's talk a little bit more about our human needs, our basic human needs, and how this also can affect our motivation, which has a direct impact on human behavior. So that's my tie-in. And after I've done my research and I've put together the PowerPoints, it's easy for me to do a tie-in to go from 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 4, etc. And so I just memorize all the buff associated with each one of these lines. And then I briefly talk about the tie-ins from each one to the next one. And I'm generally able to stand up and talk about this from start to finish just by having the PTS in front of me and no notes. Maybe a lesson plan, but definitely no notes. I don't agree with the use of notes. I think that if you either know the information or you don't know the information. If you are having to use notes and you're totally relying on notes, it even says it in the Aviation Instructor's Handbook that those who rely too heavily on notes don't know the information enough to teach it. So, now that we've discussed that, let's go over the human needs and motivation. Sometimes this stuff is not necessarily in the correct order in the book, so me personally, I don't like to talk about human needs prior to talk about motivation, but if you look in the book, you'll see that human needs and motivation actually comes first. I mean, that human needs actually comes first, and motivation is down here on 1-5. So if I was to click to the next slide, talk about motivation, I like talking about motivation first. I think it makes the conversation flow better. And of course, you can see here that motivation is the reason that one acts or behaves in a certain way, and here's the definition for that. I actually thought this whole entire thing was worth saying or talking about, and that's the reason why I put that whole entire word in that whole entire verbiage in my PowerPoint. So we've got the thing on the motivation, and we're going to be able to talk about motivation. So you talk about it's the reason why one behaves in a certain way. I stated earlier that the reason why you guys are here, girls are listening to this, guys and girls listen to this, is because you're motivated to go through this course to move on to do something else, and that's your motivation. But remember that this FOI stuff is not about you. It's not about you teaching this stuff to another instructor. That's not what it's about. It's about you understanding how a person learns. That way you can be able to become a better instructor. And you won't get frustrated with a student. Numerous other things. But if you understand your client, you can train them better and train them easier, and sometimes train them a lot faster. And it just works out better if you know what you're doing. The psychology side of this thing is immense. Immense, I'm telling you. And you just have this little tiny course to go through, so it shouldn't be that much of a problem. Okay, so now that we did the definition of human behavior, and we did our tie-in, and now we're talking about human needs and motivation. So we talk about our motivation, and then of course I have to go back up because I do it like I said, I do it a little bit different. So then I would talk about the human needs again after that. So like I said, I like to talk about motivation first, and then go into the human needs, and then of course I just have this right out of here. Human needs are all things required for normal growth and development, and they're satisfied in order of importance. And you can see here they are here. And, the way I talk about this is exactly the way it would be when someone is training. So, like, you got physiological needs. I go, yeah, so little Jimmy just started flight training. And, little Jimmy's, he walks into the school and his instructor comes in and his instructor says, "Hey, Jimmy, welcome to ABC Flight School. Very nice to have you here. Let's walk you around through the training center. Let me show you where the water fountain is. Let me show you where the air conditioner controller is on the wall. Let me show you where the snack machine is. Let me show you where the study room is. Let me show you where the recliners and lounges are, and the big screen TVs with Netflix on it, and other things. Maybe we'll leave this little item out here. I don't think that takes a big part in the flight training. At least it wasn't in mine. At least it wasn't in mine. Okay, so we're looking on here and we're trying to satisfy these needs. So unless I have these basic needs met, I can't go on up into safety and security. So here's all the needs down here are basically broken down. There's one down here that is not up in this pyramid, which is this particular block. Oh, this particular block here, which is cognitive and aesthetic. So, of course, I do write it into my a pretty good bit. I do have everything there. The way that I have my presentation out, this is, of course, what I use when I'm instructing. So this is what the student sees. And then, of course, I have my notes behind the counter. So I want to be able to, these are notes that I would actually bring in. So it sounds like I know what I'm talking about when I'm teaching. And I think I've been doing it long enough. I think I do, maybe. But just don't ask me any questions on it and we'll be fine. All right, so I've got that here, the cognitive and aesthetic, and I would throw that in their list. Even like I said, it doesn't appear in the pyramid here, which is kind of weird, but that's just the way it is. So now we've talked about human needs and motivation, and now we have to go into defense mechanisms. So now we have to think about a tie-in that would go from human needs and motivation into defense mechanisms. And let's talk about one of those tie-ins. You probably want to say something like, you know, we've talked about we've got our person in the door. We know that I've trained several of these private pilot applicants before. I know what they want to look at and what they want to do and how they want to train and what motivates them and whatnot. So I've got him in the door, and because I know all this thing, it's going to be easy for me to start his training and to work with him through his training. And then you got the human needs that you have to satisfy in that order, and then what seems to motivate them. But there can be some issues as the person is going through the training in which they're really not going to account for their ideas. They're not going to take They're not going to be take responsibility for their shortcomings and while they're training, because nobody's perfect in training. And so there may be many things that happens during their training in which they're going to be very defensive about, and we call these defense mechanisms. And if you go to the text here, you have the human needs and motivation there, and then of course you have your defense mechanisms. And of course I go over here with the defense mechanisms here, and I have this acronym that I go with, and I have a bunch of text down here at the bottom. But I really just went down the book and just wrote down in the order that they're listed. So this is one of those things in which you go to the Flight Instructor Practical Test Standards and it says defense mechanisms. And it doesn't say anything after that. It doesn't say like doctor, FCPR, or whatever acronym that you're learning. Nobody cares. Seriously, just do whatever you memorize. Don't worry about anybody else. So this is where I got my information from. So I would just go to the book, I would look up defense mechanisms, and I wrote down the defense mechanisms, and I wrote them down in a way that I can remember them. Okay. So after that, there's if you look at the red line here, human factors inhibit learning, and that's what I went into right when I first started. That was part of my tie-in. And then we have defense mechanisms. And if you can look down here, you can see that there's after that, it just goes right into student emotional reactions. So if I go back to my PTS, you can see here that the next thing is student emotional reactions. I went down through the text and I wrote down some things in which I thought were relative to student emotional reactions. And anxiety, dealing with rapid anxiety response, the normal reactions to stress, which you can see here, is very small. Abnormal reactions to stress, I developed an acronym for this, PRESIM, and I thought that was relatively easy to understand. Here is where the break in the lecture is really going to have, or the break in your talking is going to go from one chapter of the instructor's handbook to another one. So from 1 through 4 is all listed in human behavior, which is that's going to be chapter 1. So in order for me to go and get the rest of this information, just see here's all your stress stuff, abnormal reactions. Then it just kind of ends here. There's the chapter summary. So here we have chapter 2, and I'm going to just fast forward right down here to chapter 3. And when we get to chapter 3, we can pick up on the rest of it. Of course, it doesn't tell you that it does, but if you picked up the book and actually looked at the book, you can actually see that that's how the information is laid out. Chapter 2 is very long. That's your task B. So if you get task B in your oral, or task C, you're going to be there for a while. So here's effective communication. It's chapter 3, and it's very, very short. And what we have here is basic elements of communication. And of course, if I go back to the PTS, you can see that's the next one, basic elements of communication. So in my PowerPoint, I created a slide for basic elements of communication. I go back to my book and I can see that there are the items there that I put in my slide. So when I'm actually going through these slides in my PowerPoint and I'm holding my iPad up in front of me and I'm just flipping through these, as I put my iPad into presentation mode and I just flip through it with my finger. So I swipe it, excuse me. And so as I'm swiping through, I'm just talking to the mirror. And once I get it down pat, then I can go talk about that in front of someone else. So your instructor should be wanting you to talk about this in front of someone else, preferably them, so they can hear you talk and hear you teach and see if you're competent enough. So as we go down through here, it just keeps tying in effectively with the book, going back and forth, all the way up into the very end, which is developing communication skills. And then in between each one of these, I use what I refer to as a tie-in. So in my personal notes, when I'm studying, I have a list of tie-ins. I've actually wrote a tie-in for each one of these, to tie in between 1 and 2, to tie in between 2 and 3, to tie in between 3 and 4. And I do that so that way when I'm presenting in front of people, it's a very standardized presentation. And I can build on it as I go further. But when I first started teaching this, I didn't have the information, just like you guys didn't. So hopefully with this, you can kind of see how the presentation is developed. So I'm going under the assumption that you don't have an instructor and that you're starting from scratch and that you really don't know which way to go. And if you do this the way that I'm telling you to do it, then when the examiner asks you in the oral, hey, have you ever read this book? You can honestly look at him in the eye and honestly say, yes, I actually have read that book. And it's going to be, you'd be surprised how short of a period of time it could actually really take you to go through all 7 of these FOI chapters. That's all 7 tasks, alpha through golf. And it's really, really quick. It probably took me maybe 7 days working in the evening time after I got home from work in order to put these presentations together. It really wasn't that bad at all. So if I can do it, I know you guys can do it. Some of you are full-time students in which you don't do anything but this. I've got a little bit long-winded here in this. I really didn't expect to talk this long, but hopefully you really got something out of this. If you didn't, post the comments. If you didn't like it, post comments. If I'm absolutely boring, post comments. Let me know. I can only better myself if you tell me whether you like it or whether you don't like it. These are going to get better and they're going to get more juicy as we go forward. However, I can't go forward and give you all the juicy stuff until I actually teach you how to do this thing from ground up, from scratch up. So I don't want to, if I can give you all the information and just show it to you on a piece of paper, but you're never going to learn it. So you got to know how to study it, and this is the way that you study it. This is the way that you develop your spiel, whatever you want to call it, that you're going to give to the examiner. Okay, good deal. If you like what you see today, make sure you subscribe, hit the like button below. I'll see you on the next video lesson. I'm Todd Shelnut. Y'all have a great day. See you. Bye.